I think we got cut off with quite at the end of George Washington, but that's okay. It was just some other story about him. But I'll pick him up again when we talk about him as the first president. I am moving into the file called Republican Experiments. In the PowerPoints, it's called Early Republic, same thing. And starting with the first slide there, this chapter is about what happened after the revolution. The revolution, number one, was it really a revolution? A revolution is a dramatic, total change of stuff. Things are completely overthrown. And the question here, of course, is, was this really what happened in America? The other half of this is what exactly did happen. We didn't move straight to a constitution. We fumbled around. We did some unsuccessful things, some trial and error, which made the Constitution possible later on. And this is a section of American history that's usually overlooked and not even taught usually in 8th grade and oftentimes in high school. So the revolution established the fact that we would rule ourselves at home rule, basically, that Britain would not tell us what to do. The question now after independence is, who will rule at home? And I would argue this is not a revolution, it is more a shift. It is more evolutionary than revolutionary. The shift is from the few in power to the many in power, because in Britain, the middle class had very little power. Average people who voted in England at the time, in Great Britain, was well under 10% of the population. So what happens in America is that we really do become more democratic, I would argue. The common man, the states are dominant. They are dominant in the war. They are dominant after the war. This is government by the people and not for the people so much. The lines in America between gentlemen and everybody else become much more blurred. And I'm quoting a British official here, Americans more than any other people are convinced that all men are born free and equal. I can go back to, of course, Ben Franklin. It is not who you are, but what you can do in America. On the other hand, you could argue that for a lot of people, this did not change. Our definition of democracy today is very different than democracy in 1783. Unrevolutionary, things that did not change. This is why it's a slow shift rather than a dramatic change. Look at the percentages of the population that still had no vote, that still had almost no power. First of all, women who really couldn't vote, and actually Puritan women who could vote before the war, the vote is taken away from them. So if you're a woman in Massachusetts, you no longer can vote in civil government. That's half the population. African Americans, which were roughly 20% of the population, they don't vote, of course. Slaves don't vote. They are property, not people, quote unquote. Native Americans don't vote. So when you add this up, this is like 75% of the public that does not even vote. And in the South, you had to own property. So that's another chunk. But this is significantly more than what was happening in almost all of Europe. The other factor to look at is who really is control, who is in power. And a lot of the people who had power before the war are still in power after the war. Example, 69% of the signers of the Declaration of Independence had a colonial position. They had a position in the colonial government. So these are government officials. These are not your average farmer. 40% of the signers of the Declaration had a college education, and this was very rare at the time. 75% of the new state governments that are put together after the war were made up of previous office holders. So the people in charge don't change so much, but there are some significant democratic changes. That first slide there, I think, is important. Important means you better know it. Okay, so what has changed after the revolution? And this is before the Constitution. The Constitution is not adopted until 1789. So you have 10 to 15 years in there, the end of the war, and the gap in between. But things are already changing much more than they were any place in Europe. First of all, every state, former colony, had a written constitution. They wanted their rights written down. If you think about it, Britain has no constitution like we have. What is the law in Britain? It is common law. Laws that were evolved to protect natural rights, life, liberty, property. But in our states, we wanted things written down because this was a problem with England. What power does the king and parliament have? It was real fuzzy at the time. Number 2, power shifts from governors to the legislatures. Before the war, the power in the colonies was the governor. He ruled. He was a little king. After the war, the governor is no longer a position of power. The legislatures make the laws. And most of them had very short 1 to 2 year terms. So you don't like somebody, you vote him out. And there was no executive veto power in any of these new states after the war. So basically, they take power away from the formerly powerful governors. This is still true today. The governor of Texas, we see his face all the time. He doesn't have technically much power. The legislature in Texas passes the laws and allocates the money. The governor does not do that at all, still. 2 House legislatures, which we still have today in almost every former colony. Why did they want 2? Because the lower house was supposed to represent the people, and the upper house, the Senate, was supposed to, as they quoted, prevent excesses of democracy. So you don't want too much power going to the common man. So already they're beginning to think about how do we check this power? How do we check democracy? New constitutions that once they were written had to be ratified by the popular vote. People voted on them. They weren't just adopted by the legislature, they were voted on by the public. A very significant fact that we talked about earlier is there was religious freedom. There is no established church. There are no state taxes in any of the new states. This is new because formerly you paid a church tax. This is still true in many countries in Europe. In Greece, you pay part of your federal, your national tax money, and it goes to support the Greek Orthodox Church. In Finland and in Scandinavia, part of your tax money goes to support the Lutheran Church. If you're not Lutheran, you can actually allocate it and you can send it to the Russian Orthodox Church or something else, but most people don't bother with that. We don't have church taxes in America. You want to support a church, you do that yourself. Those donations are tax deductible. Most people don't bother with that, and it has to be over a certain amount as well. We got rid of aristocracy. This is symbolic, but hugely symbolic. We got rid of all the British titles. We have no Lord so-and-so in America. We have no Sir so-and-so in America. We got rid of the knee pants, thank goodness. We got rid of the fact that you had to tip your hat and bow to superiors. Even our judges, we kept the black robes, but we got rid of those silly long white wigs, which they still wear in England on the high courts. We also got rid of primogeniture and entail, that property had to be kept in one piece and could only go to the eldest son. This was by law in England. This disappears in America. You can give your property to whoever you want, starting in 17, really after the Revolutionary War. In Britain, you have more or less 400 families that controlled the country. Their average income was, I'm using this British pounds, but let's say $40,000 a year, which was a huge amount of money at the time. The richest American planter made less than $2,000 a year. So we don't have this huge, very wealthy class. We have wealthy people, particularly in the South, but they're not even in the same running as what was going on in Europe. We've always resisted ranks, births, status in America. You meet a stranger, hi, how are you? Nobody asks your income. Nobody asks your title. This disappeared with the Revolution. There was more access to land after the Revolution. The areas that had been set aside for the king, particularly forests for his shipbuilding, were now open. They were now public lands in the different states. The Penn family, who privately owned land in Pennsylvania, that was a private colony, they lose their title to the land, which was given to them by the king. In Pennsylvania, 21 million acres were opened up. In addition, at the end of the war, those loyalists, the ones who owned large pieces of land, they had their lands confiscated by the states, and those went to the states and were broken up into more or less 200-acre small farms. Immediately, people begin to claim land or buy very, very cheap land. In North Carolina, one resident talked about there are 1,000 wagons a week that are moving west to go beyond the mountains and claim almost free land. I think it's very interesting that another thing that happens after the war is the state capitals are moved west. Why? Think about Austin. When Texas was made a state, there was nobody living in Austin. It was nothing. It was a ford across the river. There was nobody certainly west of Austin except Comanches. Why did they make Austin the capital if all the population was near Nacogdoches? They made an X on the map, and Austin is in the middle, or very close to the middle of Texas. What happened after the Revolution is all of these old capitals, like Jamestown, were moved inland and moved west. Inland because you want to get away from the British Navy, moved west towards the center of the state. So instead of Charleston, South Carolina, you have Columbia. Instead of Jamestown on the coast, you have Richmond. Instead of New York City, you have Albany, New York, 200 miles up the Hudson River. Instead of Portsmouth, New Hampshire on the coast, you have Concord, New Hampshire, far, far inland. Every single one was moved inland. Literacy, we always forget literacy. Literacy keeps expanding in America where it didn't in most of Europe. By 1800, Americans have more newspapers than any other country in the world in raw numbers and by percentage compared to the population. There were 97 newspapers in the 13 colonies in 1790. There are 365 in 1800. We also have a completely free press with no restrictions. This is also different than most of Europe. Another factor that's in there is more education for women. We begin to realize that educated women are a good thing, particularly in a democracy. And this is still true today. Educated mothers, they're not so worried about educated women for themselves, but educated mothers produce educated children. This is still true today, statistically. So education, more education is open to women, not college education, but certainly public education everywhere. They were actually given the vote in New Jersey after the war, and then 1807, New Jersey took the vote away from women. And then we had to wait over 100 years to actually get the vote back. And Puritan women lose their vote. But at least they can get more education. Slavery is another interesting angle here. After the war, the issue of slavery, which clearly contradicts democracy, becomes much more prominent. And this is a movement led by those wonderful guys, the Quakers. For the first time, slavery is openly discussed and even challenged, particularly by the Quakers. In every state, abolition societies were created after the war. This includes the southern states. There were Southerners who were totally opposed to slavery. After the Revolution, they begin to organize. The first abolition society was formed by Quakers 5 days before Lexington, the Battle of Lexington. So after the war, it begins to escalate. After the war in northern states, slaves were gradually emancipated. So within 20 years, there are almost no slaves after the war in northern states. Even in Virginia, 10,000 were freed in the 8 years after the war. In addition, northern states passed laws requiring jury trials for slaves accused of a crime, and the owner had to provide proof of the crime. Things begin to open up, even in the South. The last thing I think is most important, and that is that white men vote. More white men vote. In 2 states, 2 northern states, anyone who paid taxes of any kind could vote. Pennsylvania, Georgia, Vermont, New Hampshire, Kentucky, any adult male voted. And of course, this means adult male taxpayers too. Even in the South, it begins to open up, and they kept property qualifications, but they were usually lowered. In 1770, only 12% of adult males in Virginia could vote because you needed 50 acres. This is still more than in Britain, and certainly more than Spain, Russia, and other places where kings rule, and nobody gets to vote. So what happened after the war is more people can vote. And I particularly like that chart in slide 2, which talks about the changes in state governments. And this is really significant. I ran into this by accident, but it's really a significant chart. Even in the South, but much more so in the North. So look at who is controlling and making the laws in individual states. Before the war, you can see the wealthy, even in the North, the wealthy have a huge block in the legislative assemblies. After the war, the lower class, the poor, become dominant. And even in the South, there is a significant shift. So the wealthy no longer control local and state governments after the war. This is a power shift, and it is brought about by the revolution. Okay. The next slide, slide 3, is the putting together of some kind of a new government during and after the war, and it is the trial run for the Constitution, and it failed miserably. They had huge problems to deal with. You won the war, now what? You have to, from scratch, put together a government out of nothing, and the world is watching. Because if this government fails, then kings will say, see, self-government's a bad idea. If it succeeds, it's going to breed revolutions elsewhere. The problems they have: can democracy work over a large area? What models do they have? Ancient Greece, where you had democratic city-states where all adult males voted, but, you know, how big are these city-states? They had 5,000 voters. Can you have a democracy over 13 different states with different money systems, different custom systems, different economies? None of them before the war had a direct democracy except for Vermont. So they look to the Swiss, they look to the Dutch, they look to ancient Greece. These are their only democratic models after the war. When Rome, which started out as a democracy, when it got too big, it became a dictatorship, and that's always the problem with democracy. In 1776 in Europe, there were 350 different political city-states of different sizes. Because you got too big, things collapsed. So the world is watching to see if we can do this. Another problem they have is, how do you balance liberty and freedom with order and control? Total freedom is anarchy, total control is dictatorship. How do you balance the two? Because you have to have both of them. We're still working on that one. Another problem that you have is, how do you get politicians that work for the good of the state and not for their personal advantage? We're still working on this one, absolutely. Can you get popularly elected representatives who will work for the public good? And there's no real answer to that. What they come up with is, slide 4, the Articles of Confederation. Now, the title tells you something, because if you remember, during the French and Indian War, Ben Franklin proposed a confederation, and it was not very successful. Also, the Confederates later on in the Civil War should have taken their lessons from the Articles of Confederation and why it did not succeed. This is a trial government from after the war starts, 1779, until we get the Constitution. And it failed miserably. As Ben Franklin said, this is a failure. It is, quote, a firm league of friendship among sovereign states. So this is a loose organization. It has very little power. They just had a war to overthrow a powerful king. What is the first thing they want to correct? Not a powerful government, and that's a problem. So their main concern is the fear of kings. All the power is held locally in the states. Don't give the states too much power. Don't give the central government too much power. So the Articles of Confederation, there is no taxing power. They cannot tax. If you can't tax, you have no money to run the government. What the Articles of Confederation could do, the central organization could recommend, quote unquote, that the states pay their proportion. And of course, nobody wants to. Well, why should I send it to a federal organization? I'll keep it in Pennsylvania. We have things to pay for here. Each state would print and collect their own customs duty, their own customs taxes, import taxes. The paper that was printed during the Revolution was totally worthless. What are we going to do about all this paper money floating around? Nobody was using the same currency. Different people in different towns and different states were using Spanish, British, German money, and 13 different kinds of their own money. Weights and measures varied from state to state, from town to town. We had no money. We could not repay the French for their help in the war. We could not repay, which we were bound by treaty to do, the British who had lost property during the war. So everything is just kind of chaos, roughly, for 10 years. Another problem with the Articles of Confederation is it took 9 of the 13 new states to pass any law. And it took 13 out of 13 to change the Articles of Confederation or to pass a tax law. So any of you who have siblings know how often, if you have 12 siblings, are all of you agreeing on something? Absolutely never. And how often will you even get 9 of 13 to agree on something? Extremely rarely. So from the beginning, the articles are handicapped. They can pass nothing. Nothing gets done. Another problem they had is there is no executive branch. We don't want a king? Okay, fine, no executive branch. There is no central authority. There's no one to make Indian treaties. There's no one to regulate the currency. There's no one to direct the government. There's a power vacuum, essentially. There is no national court system. There was no capital. There was no place to meet because everybody was fighting, well, we want the national government in our state, of course. So what they did is they rotated. Every month they met in a different city. So they'd go from Philadelphia to New York to Providence to Albany. Nobody knew what was going on. It was totally chaotic. You can't keep moving a government around month by month. If you have no money, you have no military, you have no army, you have no navy. After the war, we had an army, I'm not making this up, of 700 men. So what power do you have in foreign affairs? Zilch. And everybody knew it. The only success of the Articles of Confederation, and you have maps in slides 5 and 6. Thank goodness Thomas Jefferson was involved with it because he laid out the plans for this. First of all, we set up a postal system. Ben Franklin did that. And for the first time in the first nation, we actually have a national postal system. The other thing was the Northwest Ordinance, which was passed in 1787, right before the Constitution. This is Thomas Jefferson, who is a bona fide genius, and this set the pattern for settlement all the way to the Pacific throughout American history. First of all, any new state, because population is already spreading west, any new state would be admitted with equal rights to the original 13 states. So as we move west, we keep getting more and more states, of course. To become a new state, you had to have 60,000 free white males, and you had to draw up a constitution. Then you submitted it to Congress, and Congress would vote to accept you as a new state, which pretty much they did until slavery became an issue later. The other part of this that is genius is the grid system. And you can see on those maps the genius of Thomas Jefferson. Because before this, how were property lines and state lines drawn? Wherever there was a river, wherever there was a mountain, wherever anybody settled. There was no order at all. And if you have ever been to a European city, you know how difficult it is to navigate around them because they were laid out without a plan as things grew, wherever the cowpaths were. So trying to get around Paris or even London today is extremely difficult. It's not a grid. Whereas in America, we laid out our new lands before settlers got there on a grid system, 640-acre lots, 6 by 6 miles, 36, and 1 out of every 36, Jefferson pushed this, was dedicated to education. Not the whole 640 acres. That was sold, but the money, the going price was about 7 cents an acre. The money from the sale of that one section, all of the money from the land sales went to the federal government. It's the only source of revenue they have. But the land sales from one went to build a school. In the middle of each township, 6 by 6, they would build a public school. The people in the area had to provide the books and had to pay for the teacher, but the school was built. So as we move west, we have a built-in system of free public education. And this is one of the few places in the world that has it, because in America, education is important. In a democracy, an educated public is vital. We don't need dumb voters. So he sets it out. Great example of this even is Austin. We're not completely a grid because we have rivers and creeks here, but most of our streets are on right angles. My favorite city is Omaha, Nebraska. If you go to Omaha, everything is at right angles. The streets are crisscrossed. Nothing is on a diagonal. And the streets in Omaha are labeled 1st Street, 2nd Street, 3rd Street, and in the other direction, A, B, C, and D Street. How brilliant is that? You can come down from Mars or any place else and find 2nd and F Street without any problem. Chicago, 1st, 2nd, 3rd Street, and in the other direction, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, the presidents in order. So we did this systematically. Thank you, Thomas Jefferson, for making our cities livable. The other thing he did was promote the ending of slavery in the new territories. The Northwest Territories are called that because they are the northwest part of the country at the time. He succeeded in getting slavery banned north of the Ohio, but not south because there were already slaves there and already settlers moving in. So they couldn't do it south of the Ohio by one vote. American history would have been totally different if one vote in Congress had voted to ban slavery any place in the new territories. But it's banned just north of the Ohio River. So after the war, it's debatable. How democratic are we? We are much, much more democratic, but not as much as we would consider democracy today. We are surely not purely democratic because 75% of adults still cannot vote. But it's a big step in the right direction compared to what most of Europe was at the same time. So this is a system that doesn't work very well, and we have to move to putting together a constitution in a constitutional convention because this is a system, the Articles of Confederation, that failed miserably. Take care, stay safe.